Mara sat cross-legged by the campfire, its flames sputtering as the night wind whispered through the ancient trees overhead. Her journal lay open on her knees, pages filled with hurried, uneven handwriting notes, sketches, fragments of remembered conversations. Yet, as she reread them, an unsettling doubt gnawed at her. The memories she had so carefully recorded seemed wrong, not just incomplete, but altered, flawed, like echoes warped by the forest's own will. The realization hit her like a cold wave. The forest wasn't just a backdrop, a silent witness to her past visits. It was an active participant, reshaping her memories, rewriting the narrative of her own life within its shadowy confines. The memories she clung to, the faces of people she'd met, the trails she'd walked, the feelings she'd felt were shifting beneath her fingers like leaves tossed in a restless wind. She pressed her palm to her forehead, trying to steady her racing thoughts. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself, but the voice was brittle, unfamiliar even to her own ears. What is real anymore? From the edge of the camp, a rustling sound interrupted her reverie. She looked up to see Elias Crane approaching, his gaunt frame silhouetted against the dimming light. His eyes, sharp and wary, were shadowed by exhaustion and something darker, and anxiety that Mara recognized all too well. "You look like hell," she said, attempting a weak smile. Elias managed a bitter laugh. "Tell me about it. This forest. It's eating at my mind. I thought I was prepared, thought I could handle it. But every day, the memories twist. Faces I've known become strangers. Places I remember morph into impossibilities." He sank down beside her, pulling a battered notebook from his pack. The pages were filled with scribbles, diagrams, desperate attempts to capture the forest's elusive influence. "Look at this," Elias said, voice low, trembling. "I've been documenting everything: the whispers, the shadows, the way my own thoughts betray me. But even these notes, I don't know if I can trust them anymore." Mara leaned in, scanning the pages. Words overlapped. Sentences trailed off into illegibility. Margins were crowded with frantic annotations. The notebook was a testament to a mind unraveling in the grip of something vast and unknowable. A sudden gust rustled the leaves above, carrying with it a faint chorus of whispers that seemed to echo faintly with her own voice. Mara flinched, eyes darting into the darkness beyond the firelight. "Did you hear that?" she asked, voice barely audible. Elias nodded grimly. "It's the forest speaking back. Or maybe it's my own mind turning against me." Silence fell between them, thick and heavy. The forest seemed to lean in closer, its breath cold against their skin. "We're losing ourselves," Mara said finally, the words tasting like ash. "If the forest can change our memories, then who are we really? What's left when the past is a lie?" Elias's eyes met hers, haunted yet resolute. "That's the edge we're standing on, the thin line between who we were and who the forest wants us to be." The fire flickered and dimmed, shadows stretching long and distorted. Mara closed her journal slowly, a fragile anchor in a sea of uncertainty. "We have to keep fighting," she said, more to herself than to Elias. "Hold on to whatever's real." But as the whispers rose again, mingling with the rustling leaves, Mara couldn't shake the creeping dread that the forest was already rewriting the story and she was losing the final say. The night deepened, swallowing the last light. Somewhere between the flickering fire and the shifting shadows, Mara felt the first true fracture in her sense of self. The forest's hunger was not for flesh or blood, but for memory itself, and it was already feeding, and Mara was losing. Yet, in the dark, a question lingered her, fragile thread of hope or despair. If the past was no longer hers, if every return twisted her into someone else, then what remained beneath the layers of forgotten truths? Was there a self to reclaim, or only an echo destined to fade? As the fire sputtered its last, Mara clenched her fists, the cold night air biting into her skin. Tomorrow, she would venture deeper. She had to, for if she didn't, the forest would consume her completely, body, mind, and soul. But tonight, at the edge of memory's abyss, Mara faced the terrifying, unyielding truth sometimes. The hardest battles are fought within, against the ghosts that wear your face, and sometimes those ghosts win. The forest waited, patient and eternal. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Mara pushed deeper into the shadowed thicket, the canopy overhead thickening until daylight filtered down in fractured shards. Her footsteps were muffled by a carpet of damp leaves, each step stirring a silence that felt unnatural, as if the woods themselves were listening. Ahead, a faint clearing emerged, bathed in a muted twilight despite the hour. As Mara entered, two figures came into view, seated on moss-covered stones. Their forms were thin, gaunt shadows of what a human should be. One's skin hung tight over sharp cheekbones, pale and stretched. The other's clothes hung in tatters, movements slow and jerky. Both stared ahead with glassy, unfocused eyes that betrayed a hollowed soul. Mara's breath hitched. "You shouldn't have come back," one whispered, voice barely a rasp, lips trembling. "They remember. They take everything. Not the person you were, but what you think you are." The other nodded slowly, a faint shiver passing through their frame. Fragments, lost pieces. We're fragments now. Mara knelt, heart pounding as she searched their faces for a spark of the people they once were. But all she found was a quiet desperation that mirrored the gnawing fear growing inside her. "Who did this to you?" Mara asked, her voice barely steady. "The forest. It remembers us differently each time," the first murmured. "It reshapes us, feeds on what makes us whole, until there's nothing left but echoes." A chill swept through the clearing as the wind stirred, carrying with it faint whispers that seemed to weave through the trees themselves. Mara's mind reeled with the weight of their words. This was no ordinary forest. It was a living archive of lost minds, a ravenous entity feasting on identity. Drawing a shaky breath, Mara pulled her worn journal from her pack. The pages were filled with her frantic scribbles and sketches, desperate attempts to anchor herself against the shifting tides of memory. She flipped to a section marked with Ilias's name, his handwriting growing more erratic with each entry. Day 7, the faces in the trees stare back, names forgotten. "I feel myself slipping. I don't trust my own thoughts anymore." Day 10, they whisper my failures. "I am not me. Who was I before this place?" I write to remember, but the words blur. Mara's fingers trembled as she closed the journal, the weight of Ilias's descent settling heavily in her chest. His fate was no longer a distant warning. It was a mirror reflecting her own precarious state. The forest was not just a place, it was a predator, patient and insatiable. A sudden rustle in the underbrush snapped Mara's attention upward. The canopy shimmered faintly, bioluminescent hues casting eerie shapes across the leaves. The whispers rose, layering over her thoughts in a relentless crescendo. Voices, half-formed words, memories not her own spilled into her mind, blurring the lines between self and other. Mara staggered toward a small pool nestled between twisted roots. She knelt and gazed into the dark water, hoping to find a moment's clarity, but the reflection staring back was fractured, flickering between her own face and distorted versions of herself, smiling, terrified, lost and fading. The image dissolved into ripples, leaving Mara clutching at the air as a cold dread settled in her bones. The forest's hunger was undeniable. Each return carved away a piece of who she was, replacing it with something alien and fragmented. And yet, the compulsion that had drawn her here burned stronger than ever, a pull she could neither resist nor fully understand. Mara's hands shook as she closed her eyes, willing herself to hold fast to what little remained of her original self. But the forest was patient. It waited in the shadows, whispering promises of oblivion and eternity, a memory that never faded but never remained whole. As twilight deepened, Mara rose, the weight of the warning signs heavy on her heart. The path ahead was fraught with peril, not just of body, but of soul. With a final glance at the hollowed figures behind her, she stepped forward into the encroaching darkness, the forest's whispers trailing close behind. "They remember," she whispered to herself, but never the same version twice. And somewhere deep within the trees, the forest listened. The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the dense canopy, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the edge of Mara's vision. The forest was alive in ways she couldn't fully grasp, whispers in the wind, the subtle creak of ancient branches swaying without a breeze, and now the presence of Lena. Mara's breath caught as she glimpsed the pale figure standing silently at the boundary of a thicket, her form almost blending seamlessly with the mist that curled low among the roots and ferns. Lena's eyes were the first thing Mara noticed, deep, reflective pools that shivered with shifting hues of green and brown, mirroring the restless forest itself. The ethereal glow that surrounded her seemed not of this world, and when Lena spoke, her voice was a soft, haunting whisper that carried the weight of countless forgotten memories. "What is the shape of a broken mirror?" Lena asked, stepping closer yet never quite entering the clearing where Mara stood. "Is it the shards or the cracks that run between?" Mara frowned, the riddle twisting inside her mind. I don't know," she admitted, struggling to tether her thoughts. The forest around them seemed to pulse faintly, the bioluminescent leaves overhead glowing in slow, rhythmic waves as if breathing. "Memories like that," Lena said, voice lilting like a song woven from the rustling leaves. "Not the fragments you hold, but the spaces between them where forgetting seeps in." Mara's heart thudded painfully as a chill ran down her spine. Lena's words stirred something deep inside her, a growing void she had tried so desperately to fill with her journals and careful retracing of steps. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a living enigma, reshaping what she thought she knew. "Why do you come to me?" Mara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you real?" Lena's smile flickered, enigmatic and sad. "Real enough to speak, yet too lost to remember who I once was. I am the question that the forest asks itself, the echo of souls swallowed whole." A sudden breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. Mara reached out instinctively, her fingers trembling as she tried to touch Lena's pale hand. But before her grasp closed, Lena's form dissolved into a swirl of leaves and mist, scattering before Mara's eyes and leaving only a cold emptiness where warmth had been. Mara staggered back, clutching her chest as a wave of despair crashed over her. She sank to the forest floor, the moss soft beneath her palms but unable to soothe the growing ache of fragmentation inside her mind. The line between what was real and what was conjured by the forest blurred alarmingly with each encounter. Night fell swiftly, and the forest's bioluminescence bathed the trees in eerie, shifting light. Shadows elongated and twisted into shapes that resembled spectral figures, faces formed of leaves, limbs of branches, all whispering in a language Mara felt, but could not understand. It was during this twilight hour that Lena returned, her presence both a comfort and a torment. "Remember," Lena murmured, her voice entwined with the rustle of leaves. "Remember who you were before the forest began to rewrite your story. But beware, the more you cling to fragments, the more the spaces between grow." Mara's eyes filled with tears that shimmered in the ghostly light. She wanted to scream, to fight, to hold onto the fragile thread of self she had left. But Lena's words echoed endlessly in her mind, a riddle with no clear answer. As she lay beneath the canopy, Mara's thoughts fractured and splintered. Faces from her past flashed unbidden, her mother's laugh, a childhood camping trip, a whispered secret she could no longer place. Each memory seemed to warp and shift, becoming less a part of her and more a ghostly echo. In a fleeting moment of clarity, Mara looked deeply into Lena's eyes once more. There, she saw not only the pale figure before her, but flickers of her own past, distorted and fading. The realization hit her like a cold wave. Lena was both a prisoner and an agent of the forest, a living riddle embodying the fragile boundary between memory and oblivion. "Who are you, really?" Mara whispered, the question hanging heavy in the night air. Lena's smile was sad and knowing. "I am the forest's question, the soul it cannot forget and yet cannot save. And you, Mara, are its next answer." The forest around them seemed to lean in closer, breathing in the silence that followed. Mara's grip on her own identity trembled, caught between the pull of memory and the encroaching void. Somewhere deep within, a part of her screamed to resist, but the forest was patient, and its riddles endless. As the night deepened, Mara curled into herself beneath the whispering canopy. Lena's words, a haunting lullaby that promised revelation and oblivion in equal measure. The forest waited, and Mara's journey into the heart of memory's horror was only just beginning. The dense canopy above filtered the one light of dusk into mottled shadows, dappling the forest floor with trembling patterns. Mara stood motionless in a small clearing, her breath shallow, as the trees around her seemed to lean and sway with a life more deliberate than the natural breeze. The gnarled branches creaked and twisted, their bark pulsing faintly with an eerie, faint greenish glow, a bioluminescence that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a heartbeat she could not hear. A whisper brushed past her ears, soft and urgent, like a sigh woven from leaves. Mara, the voice was unmistakably hers, yet fractured, layered with echoes of other voices she had long forgotten. She spun around, eyes wide, but the forest remained still, save for the slow, deliberate dance of shadows and light. Heart pounding, Mara took a careful step forward. The scent of damp earth and musk filled her nostrils, but beneath it lay something else, a faint tang like rusted metal or forgotten memories stirred from their grave. Her fingers trembled as she tightened her grip on the worn leather cover of her journal. The pages inside scrawled with frantic notes and half-remembered sketches, desperate attempts to anchor herself in a reality that felt increasingly slippery. Voices rose again, this time layered, overlapping fragments of conversations. Laughter, cries, all swirling through the branches like a storm of forgotten souls. The trees seemed to lean closer, their forms shifting subtly, bark rippling as if breathing. Mara's skin prickled with a cold that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. She recalled Ilias's warnings, his haunted eyes reflecting the same terror she now felt. "It's not the flesh the forest wants," he had said, voice tight. "It feeds on memory, on who you are. Each time you come back, it reshapes you, twists the parts that make you you." A spectral figure floated between the trunks, its form woven from swirling leaves and brittle branches. The figure's face was a shifting mask of sorrow and loss, eyes empty except for the faint glow of remembered pain. Mara watched, breath held, as it drifted closer, its presence a chilling reminder of all who had been consumed. Her journal slipped from her hands, pages fluttering like the wings of a trapped bird. Images surged behind her eyes, moments of laughter with friends who now felt like strangers, fragmented faces whose names she struggled to recall, memories dissolving like mist. Panic tightened around her chest as the forest's hunger pressed in. "You fight what you cannot hold," Lena's voice whispered beside her, soft and haunting. The ethereal figure stood just beyond the reach of the bioluminescent glow, her pale hair flowing as though underwater. Her eyes reflected the forest itself, ancient, vast, and unknowable. "Why do you linger here?" Mara asked, voice cracking. Lena smiled, a riddle wrapped in shadows. "Because this place remembers what you forget, and forgets what you remember. Because here, memory is a currency, an identity a fading echo." Mara reached out, but Lena's form dissolved into a swirl of leaves, carried away by a sudden gust that smelled of rain and old decay. The forest closed in around her, alive and watching. The trees whispered promises and threats in the same breath, feeding on the fractures in her mind. She staggered back toward the path, clutching her head as the memories shattered and reformed like broken glass. The forest's hunger was no longer a distant threat. It was a living presence, twisting her essence, eroding the fragile threads that held her identity together. And Mara knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that survival meant resisting a force as old as the roots beneath her feet. A consciousness that did not hunger for flesh, but for the very soul she fought to keep. The shadows lengthened, and the whispering canopy closed tighter still, as if the forest itself waited, patient, eternal, and hungry. Mara's hands shook as she pressed the pen hard against the coarse pages of her journal. The firelight flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like restless spirits among the towering trees. The bioluminescent glow, soft and unnatural, bathed the forest floor in an eerie light that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She glanced up from her scribbling, eyes scanning the dark woods that surrounded her camp. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint whisper of the wind. But beneath that quiet lay something else, a subtle, pressing presence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Each word she wrote was a desperate attempt to tether herself to reality. Her journal was no longer a mere record of her journey. It was the last fragile thread holding together the fragments of her unraveling mind. Yet, even as she wrote, the certainty of her memories slipped further away, dissolving like mist in the morning sun. The faces of those she once knew, friends, family, even herself, blurred and shifted, becoming shadows that flickered just beyond reach. Mara closed her eyes, trying to summon a clear memory, but the images that came were warped and fragmented. There was a laughter, distant and hollow, that turned to sobbing, a warm hand that slipped through hers like smoke. The forest's influence gnawed at the edges of her identity, its hunger insatiable and cold. She could feel it in every whispered rustle, every shifting shadow, a presence that consumed not flesh but the very essence of the self. The journal slipped from her fingers, landing open on the ground. She leaned forward, staring at the words she had written moments before, yet they seemed strange, unfamiliar, as if penned by someone else. Panic rose in her chest. She scrambled to her feet, breath coming fast and shallow, and stumbled towards the small pool of water nearby. The surface was still, a perfect mirror reflecting the canopy above. But as Mara peered into it, the reflection wavered and changed. The face staring back was not the Mara she knew. The eyes were sunken, the skin pale and stretched tight over sharp bones. The mouth twisted into a silent scream, an echo of pain that resonated deep within her. She reached out, fingertips brushing the cold surface, but the image shattered like glass, rippling into nothingness. A sudden chill swept through the clearing. Mara shivered, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. The whispers grew louder, unintelligible voices weaving through the trees like serpents of sound. And then, a faint voice emerged from the depths of her memory, fragile yet insistent. "Remember," it said. "Hold on." It was Elias. His face flickered in her mind's eye, pale and gaunt, eyes haunted by the forest's grasp. His warnings echoed, a ghostly refrain that refused to be silenced. "This place changes you," he had said. "It feeds on what makes you, you." Mara staggered back from the pool, clutching her head as the voices multiplied, swirling around her. The forest seemed to pulse with life, the trees bending subtly as if leaning in to listen, to consume. She tried to steady her breath, to focus on something real, but the world tilted and shifted beneath her feet. Determined, she began retracing the path she had taken earlier, one she thought she remembered clearly. But the trail betrayed her. Familiar landmarks warped and twisted. A tree that had stood straight now leaned at an impossible angle, its bark flowing like liquid. Leaves rustled with unnatural motion, shadows stretching and shrinking in defiance of any logical light. Her footsteps faltered, panic rising as the forest closed in. The path seemed endless, looping back on itself in impossible ways. Every turn brought new distortions, new fragments of memories that felt both hers and alien. She reached out to steady herself against a gnarled trunk, its surface cold and slick, veins like pulsing roots snaking beneath the bark. A whisper brushed her ear, soft and sibilant. "You are not lost," it said, but changed. Mara's heart hammered. She shook her head, fighting the creeping dissolve inside her mind. "No," she whispered, "I am me." But the forest only answered with silence and the slow, relentless erosion of self. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had lost meaning here. Mara sank to the ground, clutching her journal close. The pages were crumpled and stained, but they were all she had left. A last, fragile anchor in a sea of shifting shadows. She opened it and read aloud, her voice trembling. "I am Mara Ellison. I am here. I remember." The words hung in the air, fragile as a spider's web, and for a moment the forest held its breath. Then the whispers resumed, darker and deeper, promising oblivion and endless echoes. Mara closed her eyes, the weight of the forest pressing down on her soul. Somewhere deep inside, a flicker of defiance remained. But the path forward was uncertain, and the self she clung to was slipping, fragment by fragment, into the memory of the grove. The forest waited, patient and eternal.